Hello and welcome back to Bookish, and welcome to what is probably just going to be a ramble, primarily about George Gissing's The Odd Women, which I just finished today, and about which I have lots of thought. So this book, I think, is supposed to in some ways be kind of a forward-looking book on women's rights and on marriage and on the role of women in society, and that's primarily because two of the main characters are women who are, kind of at the forefront, I think, of rethinking the characters, or at the forefront of rethinking women's roles in society and what women should and should not be doing. This is Miss Barfoot and Rhoda Nunn, which I think is probably a really good name. Those two women are these women who are living differently. They're working. They're trying to help educate other young women in to be practical, to be able to be independent by earning their own money. And I think the overall point that they're supposed to be making is that if possible, women should seek financial independence. Now, they take this in different ways, and they approach the idea particularly of marriage for women in different ways. Miss Barfoot is open to the idea of young women marrying, and continuing that traditional idea, and Ms. Nunn is increasingly, or is very outspoken against the idea of women with any kind of intellectual ability marrying and, in a sense, selling themselves short. This kind of sets the stage then for the action which takes place in the novel, which, shouldn't surprise you, largely surrounds the issue of marriage. And there are all kinds of marriages depicted here. There are unhappy marriages where one person loves the other far more than the other appears to, or one person seems to be selfish while the other is too giving. There's a marriage between a young woman and an older man. There are marriages in which a young woman marries an older man for the financial security, and so unlike her sisters, she doesn't end up older and unmarriageable and therefore lonely. There is a proposed marriage between what we would think of as confirmed bachelor and Miss Nunn herself, which comprises a lot of the real interest, I think, in the novel. This kind of almost a battle of wits, a battle of pride, a battle of ethics, a battle of modernity between Edmund Barfoot and Ms. Nunn, and whether or not essentially Ms. Nunn is going to back down from her principles of being its marriage and love for women of intellect and capability, which she certainly is, and whether or not Mr. Barfoot is going to be able to, he's kind of a rogue, a rogue made with a heart of gold perhaps, who's trying to essentially seduce her into falling in love with him, and in the process he kind of falls in love with her, and how their relationship is going to work out. And so there are all kinds of things in messages, I think, in Gissing's book about marriage and about women. But one of the things I think is most interesting is that, and perhaps this is because it is a Victorian novel, every female character who plays a major role in the novel at one point or another is tempted either into marriage or is tempted into an affair, whether they're single or married, and that women are clearly shown in the book to be walking a fairly narrow line in which they can possibly lose everything by making the wrong connection, by trusting the wrong man, or they can end up, essentially depressed and lonely, and secret alcoholics with no prospects and no real hope for the future. These women without men give the book its title. They're referred to by Miss Barfoot and Miss Nunn, Miss Nunn is Miss Barfoot's protege in this kind of endeavor to teach young women practical skills, secretarial skills, so they can be financially independent. They don't agree on everything, but they do live together, and they are close friends of one another, and they agree on lots of things. They refer to women without men as odd women. By their counts, there were something like 500,000 odd women living in Great Britain at the time, or living in England, I guess. at the time. These were women who were widows. These were women who were spinsters. These were women who were prostitutes. And in some cases, these were women who had chosen not to marry, which is, of course, the course that Miss Barfoot and Miss Nunn have taken. But neither one perhaps as voluntarily or as with as much conviction as appears in the beginning. It's a really interesting novel. And its ideas about women and marriage, I think, are really interesting at the time. I'm not sure it's quite as revolutionary as it might be. I read 2 other Victorian novels this year. I read Jane Eyre, which, if you don't know, centers a lot around marriage. And I read Barchester Towers, which, at least I would say the secondary plot of Barchester Towers is the remarriage of Eleanor Harding, or Eleanor Bold, the old warden, Septimus Harding's daughter, the prospects of her remarrying. And I think the reality is that while Gissing probably was more revolutionary in the outcome of his book, and a lot less, a lot more grim, and a lot more perhaps of a realist, and a lot more cynical than either Charlotte Bronte or Anthony Trollope, that increasingly Victorian writers were looking at marriage in different ways all along. Now, if I think I'm right in saying that of the 3 novels I read, Jane Eyre is the oldest, Barchester Towers is in the middle, and The Odd Women is the more recent, or was published later in the Victorian era. And if you think about those novels and what they say about women and marriage, there's kind of a theme, a through theme, I think, that can connect all of them, or connect Jane Eyre and Barchester Towers to Gissing's The Odd Women. Jane Eyre is determinedly independent. She is going to be her own person. Even when she falls in love with Mr. Rochester the first time, his efforts to control her, to make her into his ideal, are, almost are offensive to her. She is determined to be her own person and not to be some kind of cosseted, doll to be looked at and admired by a man. She's determined to continue thinking her own thoughts and having her own opinions and confronting Mr. Rochester with them, even as he, is more and more, as he falls in love with her, is more and more determined to hold her up as some kind of his ideal of what a woman should be. And in some ways, the incident in finding out that Mr. Rochester's already married is what saves her from that. And then she goes off and she kind of falls in love with another man who really wants to marry her because he thinks she can help him with the work he wants to do, but he really isn't in love with her. And there she again refuses to marry without the idea of love. She is determined that she's going to essentially have it all. She's going to marry a man she loves who will allow her to be her own person. And of course, Mr. Rochester's accident creates the opportunity for her to do that. That's a pretty, I think, revolutionary idea, and I think that's what makes Jane Eyre such a, in some ways, such a lasting and important novel. But it is a fairly modern idea. In Barchester Towers, Eleanor Bold has 3 suitors in the novel, and even though Trollope is, I think, dealing with that humorously in the way in which she is confronted with these suitors, he nonetheless, I think, gives us a real kind of insight into the pain and problems that a woman like Eleanor Bold would run into. Now, Eleanor Bold had been married. Her husband, John Bold, who'd been involved in the warden and her father essentially losing the wardenship at Barchester. Eleanor Bold is a widow, and she's a widow of some means. Her husband left her a considerable sum of money, and unlike Jane Eyre, who has no wherewithal, no money, at least for part of the novel, she is in part a target for men seeking to improve their own situation by marrying her for her money, or for her money and influence. Thus, Obadiah Slope, the oiliest person in Barchester Towers, sets his eyes on her. She's also the target of a marriage plot by the Stanhope families to get her to marry Bertie Stanhope, to kind of save him from basically just dissolution because has such a weak character. And then the third suitor is the man she will essentially fall in love with, and that is Francis Arabin. Yeah, that's his name. Now, in all those occasions, in two of those occasions, Eleanor is the target of marriage schemes where men are trying to more or less convince her to marry them for reasons of their own that don't have a lot to do with love. They may, in the case of Bertie, have to do with affection, but they don't have anything to do with love. And she then is the target. And naturally, she marries the man because, for all his cynicism and wit, I think Trollope wants to have a nice, happy ending in this book. She marries the man who truly loves her. She marries the man who's more her equal. She marries a man who is truly in love with her, as Rochester and Jane are truly in love with one another in the book, and that we have to believe that will lead to a happier marriage. So that then brings us to the Odd Women. So the only happy marriage that I can think of that exists in the Odd Women is between two really minor characters. The man is a friend of Edmund Barfoot, and because of poverty, he has waited to get married until he's started making some money. And he's makes some money because he published his book about mathematics, and he gets a job lecturing at the University of London, and he finally marries a woman who has essentially been engaged to him for 13 years. And they get married, and they are truly happy, and that marriage is transformative for the woman involved, even if it does kind of curb Mr. Barfoot's friend's ambition somewhat. But that marriage, I think, gives Mr. Barfoot hope that marriage is possible, that marriage can bring happiness, and probably causes him to pursue Rhoda Nunn in the book, and to go beyond perhaps just the enjoyment of getting a woman who said she would never marry to agree to marry him, to actually loving her and having some hope for the institution of marriage. So, we have then the book centered around this very fiercely independent woman determined not to marry, who is Mr. Barfoot's intellectual, spiritual, forward-thinking equal, and whether or not those two are actually going to get married. The juxtaposed to that is the incredibly unhappy marriage of Monica Madden and Mr. Whittleson, which is a marriage which Monica enters into because she doesn't want to wind up lonely and destitute like her older sisters, and Mr. Whittleson falls head over heels in love with a much younger woman. I think he's something like 20 years her elder, and she marries him for the security. And that marriage quickly goes south because to him, that marriage means that she's going to conform to his ideas of being a wife, and she's going to essentially limit herself to his company, and that's not what she wants, and that leads to tension, and that leads to tragedy. So, Gissing is showing us a bad marriage and essentially what is a marriage denied, and suggesting to us, I think, that the marriage denied was, of course, far superior, and that women should seek to enter into marriage with men who are their equals, and to seek men who are their equals, and not to marry for wealth and security and those kinds of things. And I think that makes it, somewhat a forward-looking book about marriage that Gissing's written, but I do think it's still connected to all those others. Eleanor Bold marries her equal in love, her equal in intellect. She marries a man who doesn't necessarily need her economically, and she rejects two men who aren't her equal in spirit, character, intellect, and who do need her money. Jane Eyre refuses to marry without love, and she refuses to be kind of the China doll of a man who does fall in love with her, and is kind of just saved from a tragedy in of itself. But I think there's a through line there in themes and development in Victorian literature about marriage, which just kind of struck me when I was reading it. If you've read these books, or if you have thoughts about Victorian ideas about marriage and how they evolve in Victorian literature, would really love to see your comments in the comment section below. And as always, thank you for watching.